Hello, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. My name is Reinhard Bütikofer, and I will be your host for the next hour and a half, roughly. I'm glad that so many of you are joining us to the launch of a study that we have commissioned. And the study will be presented by its main author, Professor Bungenberg, and his assistant, Mr. Pieter Van Vaerenbergh. We're very glad, gentlemen, to have you with us today and are very excited to hear your introductory remarks. The study looks at legal options for a China-targeted anti-subsidies control mechanism. And this study comes in the context of the announcement made a while ago by Commission that it would present a white paper on an instrument on foreign subsidies. This white paper is supposed to be published shortly, and we wanted to contribute to this conversation. The announcement by Commission provoked a new debate on possible options for an instrument on foreign subsidies to address the distortive effects of non-EU state subsidies inside our internal market. In order to look at that, we commissioned this new study to Professor Bungenberg from the University of Saarland, in which he explores the legal options for an instrument of anti-subsidy investigations and countervailing duties based also on Section 15 of China's WTO accession protocol. He looks into the circumstances under which this trade instrument can be applied and in which manner. So, before I give the floor to our introductory presentation, I would just like to shortly introduce the presenters. Professor Bungenberg is director of the Europa Institute and professor of public law, European law, and public international law at Saarland University in Germany. And he's also visiting professor at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. And then he has a long and distinguished CV, which I will not read to you. And then Mr. Pieter Van Vaerenbergh, who has supported Professor Bungenberg in producing the study, is research associate and PhD candidate at the chair of Professor Bungenberg at the Saarland University in Germany. And after the two gentlemen present the study, we will discuss the study with three experts, namely Wolfgang Mueller from DG Trade, my dear colleague Inmaculada Rodriguez-Pinero Fernandez, and Mr. Friedolin Strack. And I will introduce these experts later before they take the floor. I would now like to hand the floor to Professor Bungenberg. Sir, it's your turn, please.
So, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Is it working?
Yes, fine.
Great. So, thank you very much again for also the invitation to present the results actually of our study here today with you in such a webinar. The current discussion identifies the need to address effects of subsidies given to Chinese enterprises. That is what we've been hearing for the past year. Actually, Chinese enterprises benefit of actually state subsidies, and these subsidies then have a detrimental effect on the functioning, again, on the EU internal market. So it's actually these subsidies within the Chinese market that then have the effect on the EU internal market. So the more general issue here is how to deal with these state distortions. So to actually elevate this to a higher level, the state distortion, state influences on markets that affect third markets. In our case, the EU internal market. And actually, the key issue behind this is, well, we all know there's different economic systems, a market-driven system in the European Union, and there's some discussions on what actually the Chinese system is, but it's probably not what we expected, what we hoped for when we had China enter the WTO in 2001. So things developed a little bit differently than we actually expected some 20 years ago now. But nevertheless, the overarching legal framework, and this is actually what also our study is really based on, is international law. It's especially WTO law. So as I just mentioned, China exceeded the WTO in 2001, and since then we actually, together with China, European Union and China, have a common legal framework, be it in trade, be it in goods, be it in services, in intellectual property. Furthermore, we have multiple international agreements also in investment. And the European Union has made it very, very clear always that it wants to find itself within the limits of international law, within the limits of international multilateral trade law. So not outside the legal framework, but within the legal framework. And this is what I want to stress from the beginning on, this, that this also was our starting point to see where actually the limits of what we are, the European Union, is allowed to do, but within the limits, not outside the limits. This was actually our starting point, and therefore it is necessary to actually examine where the limits of international economic law lie. This is right now a task that is discussed. This discussion is going on in investment law. Remind you of the investment screening instruments there, in procurement law with the international procurement instrument. It's discussed in merger control law, and also, of course, for the past years, especially within the area of international trade law, and there on the European Union level, the so-called trade defense instruments. So anti-dumping, safeguards, and what we are going to deal with here, the anti-subsidies law. Interestingly, the recent modification of EU anti-dumping law has led to the abandonment of the effective and easy to use third country method after some 15 years of Chinese membership within the WTO. It was to discuss the further application of this third country method. But the result then was, well, the European Union changed its anti-dumping law. So now we have a very different approach in Article 2 of the basic anti-dumping regulation, giving up more or less a very, very effective and easy to use method. Well, when taking a look at Section 15 of the Chinese Accession Protocol, we find that this Section 15 not only deals with anti-dumping, but also with anti-subsidies law. And there then the question was, well, actually, do we have some reserves? Do we have different possibilities in the so-called anti-subsidies law? In anti-dumping law, we used to use a country-specific method. Today, not anymore. Today, we're not discussing anymore, is it a market economy, is it a non-market economy, but we're discussing, well, are there state distortions, yes or no? So there we kind of, in anti-dumping law, gave up this country-specific approach for whatever reason. Differently in anti-subsidy law, when targeting China, we will have to use This might be, from political point of view, a difficulty, but we will have to use a country-specific approach. When we rely on Article 15, Section 15 of the Chinese Accession Protocol, this is only applicable, well, when we have imports from China. So it's again, a country-specific approach, and we're actually dealing with a WTO plus obligations that China entered into in 2001. And this is also a very, very important issue when we discuss these different methods. China agreed to the Chinese Accession Protocol, of course, so it's not such a big surprise now, should not be such a big surprise if we evaluate, if we examine different new methods how to deal with Chinese imports. So this is what we actually dealt with this famous Section 15 of the Chinese Accession Protocol. And here the very interesting thing is that we can apply the Section 15 totally different today than in regard to countervailing duties and subsidies, as it is possible in the way or in the field of dumping. In dumping, in the area of dumping, just to remind you of this, we have this 15-year expiry date. I don't want to discuss this here, but then we had some kind of a 15-year date that we had to discuss. I do not want to reopen this debate again here. Thanks to the negotiators, we do not have any time limitations in regard to 15b, and 15b is this section, you can read it, that deals with subsidies, with countervailing duties, and there is no expiry date there. So this is the very, very important starting point. You also find different discussions on the negotiating history of 15b, and from these discussions, I would take that there is no mistake, that there is no expiry date, but that actually this was done well with intent. So 15b applies to subsidies and countervailing duties under one condition. We can apply Article 15, Section 15b, whenever we face special difficulties. So this is what we actually will have to discuss here. What about special difficulties? So whenever we face special difficulties within China, we actually can apply this very specific norm. The provision has then multiple advantages in its application compared to the normal calculation rules that are laid down in the so-called anti-subsidies instrument. And these new calculation methods that we can then apply, they're not specified. So it's up to us actually to create new calculation methods. It's up to the user, to the European Commission to come up with new suggestions how such a calculation method, once the scope of application is there of this article, how we calculate the benefit that is given to a specific good. Here, also again, a little background. We are used in the European Union when we deal with subsidies, when we deal with state aids, that there's a lot of transparency. This is actually what Articles 107, 108 foresee for all state aids, subsidies within the European Union, that transparency is a key issue within the European Union. Well, we have to remind ourselves this is very unique. This is something we do not see in other countries, for sure not in the People's Republic of China, that there really is transparency within state aids, within subsidies. What we read in all the testimonies, in all the reports, that actually the difficulty in anti-subsidies law is a lack of transparency. And therefore, we have to deal with this lack of transparency. And what we do here is actually that we try to shift the burden of proof when it comes down to transparency. That we say in our suggestion, when we deal with China, and this is actually what also the European Commission, from my point of view, discussed, we are facing special difficulties when dealing with China. And because we are facing these special difficulties, we are then allowed to apply a different calculation method. So our approach here is, first of all, to discuss this notion of a special difficulty. And we say, well, whenever state-owned enterprises are involved in the production chain, in the import-export business of a good that is exported to the European Union, then actually we argue as a starting point, we are facing a special difficulty. Well, next step then would be, well, leave it up to the importer or to the Chinese government, or leave it to the Chinese state-owned enterprise to actually argue that there is no special difficulty, that there was no subsidy at hand. So we shift the burden of proof here. Mr. Van Vaerenbergh is going to briefly discuss this in 3-4 minutes from now. So here we work with this shift of burden of proof when we actually discuss the scope of application. So there we see 15b actually as a joker in the game of trade defense instruments. Well, when we argue there is a special difficulty and Chinese enterprises cannot actually argue in a different way, then it is possible for us on the second level, in the second step, to apply a different and alternative calculation method. This alternative calculation method can be either an adjustment or relying on other prices, third country prices. We're used to this method from the old anti-dumping. Well, adjustment is one possibility. You can read this in 15b. What does actually adjustment mean? What can we do when we adjust prices? Well, we see this right now in a proposal by the European Commission in the field of public procurement. And there it is argued that in rare circumstances, well, we just use an add-on amount. For example, we say, well, the specific product is coming from a market with special difficulties. And because this good is coming from a market with special difficulties, we add on, let's say, 10% of the amount. Then again, we could use a shift of burden of proof, and the importing enterprise could argue, well, there's some state interference, but it's only 5% that we should add on. So we can always work with this burden of proof, shift of burden of proof. And if adjustment is not possible, we can, as I already mentioned, used to be the case in anti-dumping law, use a so-called third country method. So third country benchmarks for the calculation of benefits could apply. We don't use Chinese prices, but we actually take prices from the US market, from the Turkish market, from other third country markets, or even we could use a factor by factor approach. This was the case, has been the case in the past actually 13, 14 years, that was actually used by the US authorities. So these are the key issues, just as an overview. And Mr. Van Vaerenbergh will now use probably 3, 4, 5, maximum 5 minutes to deal with the burden of proof issue.
Thank you, Professor. So as said, Section 15b of China's Accession Protocol explicitly authorizes investigating authorities such as the Commission to rely on alternative external benchmarks when calculating the amount of subsidy granted by the Chinese state. And the precondition is the existence of special difficulties in the application of the normal rules of the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. Now, Section 15b grants the Commission in considerable latitude, because this term, special difficulties, is nowhere defined or circumscribed in any way. This contrasts to the carefully crafted conditions for application of external benchmarks under the normal rules, which has been interpreted rather strictly by the appellate body and the jurisprudence of the WTO. So the evidentiary burden on the Commission can be lower under Section 15b to rely on external benchmarks than under the normal rules of the agreement. So the Commission could just argue to simply rely on the fact that there are difficulties in obtaining information, that there is a huge lack of transparency, or that the collection of information is a too difficult task, amongst other difficulties, to trigger the application of external benchmarks. And as Professor Bungenberg has already outlined before, it may also be considered, if it's possible, within this term of special difficulties, to include a shift in the burden of proof, putting the onus on China to prove that market conditions exist in order for alternative benchmarks not to be applied, where the Chinese government would need to establish a transparent system of subsidies in a specific sector, in a specific production chain of an imported good, in a sector where state-owned enterprises are very present. Now, such discussion on the shift of the burden of proof does not come out of thin air. It's also one of the central questions regarding the upcoming new instrument on foreign subsidies. The main point of interest for many trade and competition lawyers in this instrument will be if there will be a flip of the burden of proof, where the burden will lie on Chinese investors to prove that they did not benefit from state subsidies if they want to do business in Europe. Whereas an important part of this new instrument will deal with the regulatory gap when it comes to subsidies from non-EU states, which specifically are used to facilitate acquisitions or to directly support the activities of subsidiaries on the EU market. The more general part may also include new powers for the Commission to examine the impact of subsidies, which can be expected to have a shift in the burden of proof, as we have been discussing, also possible under Section 15b of China's Accession Protocol. Now, the new instrument on foreign subsidies, as Mr. Bütikofer has already announced, is supposed to be presented by the Commission on 17 June, and in any case later this month. So it will be interesting to see what the approach is there. With these comments, I will give the word now back to Professor Bungenberg.
So thank you. So these are some key points we think that can be used in the ongoing discussion on making countervailing duties more effective. It's probably a very, very different approach than the one that we're going to see being presented by the European Commission. Why that? As I said actually in the intro, what we're using here is a country-specific approach. So it is probably an approach you can make when you're sitting in the ivory tower. If you're just having to think about where are the legal limits, what is politically or economically feasible that is probably a totally different question. So our idea was to again lay out the limits from a legal point of view. We're not saying that this is the very, very best idea from a political point of view. This is what you in the parliament will have to discuss, or also in the European Commission. This is not up to us. So we are actually independent, and therefore we are making such a probably for some viewers an extreme country-specific approach. Thank you so much for giving us these 20 minutes to present to you the key ideas of our study.
Okay, thank you very much, gentlemen, for introducing us to the research that you have done. We will now turn to our experts, giving each of them, let's say, 5 to 7 minutes to present their first comments to that research. And I hope that we can start with Mr. Mueller from the Commission. Are you there on the phone, Mr. Mueller?
I am there on the phone. Good morning, everybody. Do you hear me?
Yes. Let me just introduce you shortly. Mr. Wolfgang Mueller is the head of unit at DG Trade, responsible for general policy relations with WTO concerning anti-dumping and anti-subsidies measures, relations with industry, and Office of Complaints in the area of the EU's trade remedies. He's been in that function for the last 6 years, but he has worked for Commission on trade issues ever since 1994. Before that, he got himself a law degree in Freiburg, a doctorate at Konstanz, and worked for the Mercedes-Benz Group. And he's also the author of a commentary on WTO subsidy and anti-subsidy law. So, Mr. Mueller, we're glad to have you. Please give your comments.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Bütikofer, and as I said, good morning to everybody. What I wanted to say is the following. So Professor Bungenberg, with his study, went into completely uncharted territory, and I think his study clearly has the merit of shedding some light on this issue, which has not really been addressed so far. I wanted to give a bit of general context because we are talking here about mostly about trade defense instruments, or more specifically about the countervailing duty instrument. And I wanted to give a little bit of context about these trade defense instruments. The first point is Professor Bungenberg has said that, well, in 2017, we have given up an effective and easy to use method, and that is true. We have shelved the analog country methodology in the area of anti-dumping, and there was a bit of uncertainty, I think, at the time as to the continued effectiveness of the anti-dumping instrument. But I think the practice so far has shown that this uncertainty, that this worries about the future effectiveness of the new rules are not warranted. If you look at our recent annual report about TDI activity in the Union, you will see also a chapter about the effectiveness of our anti-dumping measures, and in fact the anti-dumping measures are as effective as they have been in the past. So that's the first point. Anti-dumping measures still manage to deal with in the current form, and as when we use them against imports from China, they still work and provide protection against unfair imports. The second point I would like to make is that the CVD instrument was not used until 2013 against imports from China, because at that time, up to that time, there was this belief you could not use CVD against non-market economy countries. And but this has changed in 2013, and up to now we had I think something like 8 measures against China. So the vast majority of our CVD action, in fact, since then, has been directed against imports from China, and the CVD instrument has developed into a powerful tool. If you look at the subsidy margins, we have found they tended to be low in the past before having them used against China. It was mostly against India. But nowadays, the subsidies found are nevertheless astounding. And the best example we have is at the moment the case against imports from tires for lorries and trucks, where you have subsidy margins of I think up to 51%. That is a lot, and that also shows how much the Chinese state supports its economy. And one further aspect in this respect, you see that, or somebody who follows closely what we are doing will see that we sort of try to track the evolution of the subsidization by the Chinese state. In the tires case, we have, for instance, countervailed the financing of the takeover of Pirelli by funds under the Belt and Road Initiative. And at the moment, we are looking at subsidies which are given by the Chinese state via to their companies in third countries, which then use this third country as a basis to export to the EU. So watch what is coming out. There is a case currently going on about glass fiber fabrics from China and Egypt. The results will be published soon, and where we will deal with this issue. So in a nutshell, what I wanted to say is the subsidy instrument has developed into something powerful in order to show how China supports its exporters, and also here it delivers. But now comes the point which is directly related to the research of Professor Bungenberg, and that is on this use of calculation possibilities which we have in the Chinese accession protocol. It is true that we have never used them, and the reason for this is up to now we did not feel that there was a need to use this. The rules in the accession protocol allow for the use of out-of-country benchmarks. But if you look at our practice, we use out-of-country benchmarks in relation to China in a regular way. Whenever we calculate, at least up to now, whenever we calculate, for instance, benefits which a company has received from loans or from the use of land, and a couple of other things, we have used out-of-country benchmarks, and that has not been created so far any big problems in the application. So in a nutshell, there was up to now no need to go beyond the general rules, which are in Article 14 of the anti-subsidy agreement. We could live perfectly well, or at least reasonably well, with these rules, and we could apply them without there being any need to resort to the special provisions in Article 15b of the accession protocol. Now, one further remark, and that brings me to the end. We have to be careful with our enthusiasm about what additional protection we get from the anti-subsidy instrument in relation to China. And the reason is the following. I was saying until 2013, the subsidy instrument was not used against China because China was considered as a non-market economy country, and where it was felt, well, dumping is the only one. Now, I'm not going to pronounce myself what China is or what China is not, but the point is, when we use the anti-dumping instrument, when we use this distortion methodology, we typically use data from outside China. So data which are a priori non-distorted, which should eliminate the distortion already in themselves. And that is the reason when we have when we have parallel anti-dumping and anti-subsidy investigations, we cannot simply, or at least up to now we haven't done it, we cannot simply cumulate the anti-dumping duty and the anti-subsidy duty. Because the idea is that probably with the anti-dumping duty, we have already captured the distortion. So if you have a 60% dumping margin and a 20% subsidy margin, you will not have a total duty of 80%. You will still stick to the duty of 60%. But that is not to say that the anti-subsidy instrument is not a useful instrument. On the contrary, it is a very useful instrument because it really shows how deep the Chinese state supports its economic operators at the detriment of our companies, which are subject to strict state aid rules. And then really last but not least, Professor Bungenberg has referred to this instrument under Action 8, which is the Commission is soon going to release a white paper. So that will not be the legal instrument as such, but it will be a paper seeking discussion. But where in fact we are not bound by the CVD disciplines because that will not be a question of imposing countervailing duties, and it will also not be a question of going to WTO dispute settlement. It is something which is beyond the scope of the anti-subsidy agreement. I hope I have more or less respected the time limit allotted to me, but we serve a sort of preliminary points which I want to make in relation to this very interesting study by Professor Bungenberg. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mueller. And now we have our second commentary, this one from Inmaculada Rodriguez-Pinero Fernandez, my dear colleague from the S&D group from the European Parliament. She's been sitting on the European Parliament's Trade Committee for 6 years. She's worked on many trade agreements, in particular regarding Mexico and Chile, but also transversal issues like women and trade and how to prevent torture through trade instruments. She's presently also the chair of the Conference of Delegation Chairs in the European Parliament. She's an economist by training. She's worked as a Spanish government official and a Spanish parliamentarian. I can't cite all your CV. I'm grateful you're with us. Inmaculada, please, you take the floor.
Thank you very much, Rainer, and thank you very much because inviting me, and thanks to Professors Bungenberg and Van Vaerenbergh for their study that they have been presented today. It's for me an honor to share this table with Mr. Mueller and with Mr. Strack. I think it is very useful to go into details when working on one of the great issues in global politics, the role of China in the world, and this especially when we talk about trade. I am going to speak in a more general terms referring to the relationship between European Union and China. China has become a technology giant while remaining a one-party regime. Meanwhile, it is not only in the European Union that there is a growing debate on the terms on which the relationship with China should be developed. This debate is also animated by our main trade partner, the United States, whose strategic rivalry with China is growing with a framework of total competition. For decades, the EU has increased its relations with China on the grounds that it was a developing country, accepting a relationship based on asymmetric rules being advantageous for the Asian giant. Europe believed that Chinese socioeconomic development and its inclusion in the value chains in the world economy made China a more responsible global actor, including a greater political pluralism and a general improvement in civil liberties and political rights. However, the opposite happened. China is more authoritarian under the Xi presidency, and it's clear that the spectacular advances made by China over the years make it possible to label it as a country in the process of developing. It has become the second largest economy in the world, with the second largest budget in research and development and defense, and its positions in the global value chains threatens the future of European companies. In this pandemic that we are still in, the role of China has become enormous, and not only because it is the origin of COVID-19, but because of the supply problems throughout the world of basic products for sanitary use, whose production is based in China. Consequently, the crisis has triggered a new debate in Europe about the necessity of a bigger diversification of the international value chains at the time of increasing European industrial autonomy. However, at this point, the EU continues to be pragmatic towards China. China represents 20% of the world economy in purchasing power parity, and therefore it is not surprising that it is a commercial and financial partner of huge importance to many European countries. The Commission always underlines that there are 3 million jobs dependent on trade with China, and that many European companies gain competitive advantages thanks to their presence in China and their contact with Chinese suppliers. However, the Commission continually calls for an end to the discrimination suffered by European companies in China, since they face various barriers, cannot access the same financial channels or the same public tenders as local companies, and do not enjoy the same level of legal protection as these. Regarding the changes in China, it must be shown that despite the fact that the EU and other Western allies have taken a more demanding path, this has not translated into a change of model there. On the contrary, the reinforcement of a strongly protectionist party-state regime has favored the internationalization of its companies in strategic sectors that are either closed or only very partially open in their markets for European companies. Chinese technological development in key economic sectors for the fourth industrial revolution, such as digital platforms, 5G, big data, and artificial intelligence, has increased such tendencies. I would also like to highlight that member states fail to have a cohesive position when it comes to relating to China. There are different positions on the supervision of Chinese investment regarding the measures to be adopted to protect the competitiveness of European companies. Nor is there a uniform position as to the involvement in recent Chinese projects. Regarding relations between China and the United States, it is evident that there is also no community of vision or interests between the North American and European authorities. The former is more focused on perpetuating the US hegemonic position. European authorities give more importance to the positive economic possibilities of the relationship. China will persevere more decisively to impose its political and economic governance models internationally. Among the different paths that can be taken in relations with China, the EU must become more united and act as an effective third pole in the face of the systemic strategic rivalry between China and the United States. I think it's a very, very important key issue. The EU needs to catalyze a consensus on this matter among member states. Between those concerned about the geostrategic implications of the rise of China and the loss of competitiveness of their companies, between those reluctant to increase the level of public interventionism to face China's competition, and between those who want to attract a greater volume of investment and financing from China. We must bet on increasing our strategic autonomy, finding a balanced relationship The rules have to be the same for everyone, and we are speaking about the necessity of new instruments for trade defense instruments against the uncompetitiveness loyal policies. Pragmatic cooperation with Beijing to secure essential medical supplies remains at the top of the bilateral agenda. The need to revive shell-shocked economies will drive many of the member states' decisions in the months ahead. The EU, together with China and other major economies, have a joint responsibility to help the global economy keep in shape and to reduce the impact of the global trade and supply chains. The EU and China continue working under the political mandate to conclude the comprehensive agreement on investment negotiations by the end of 2020. But the content is much more important than the date, and important asymmetries remain to be addressed in key offensive sectors. China needs to step up its ambition on level playing field, state-owned enterprises, and transparency for subsidies, as we have already said, sustainable development, and to make more efforts to rebalance the asymmetry in the respective levels of openness. In short, COVID-19 has exposed Europe's industrial dependence on China, making a strategic change in European trade, industrial, and competition policy urgently necessary. This study is undoubtedly very useful for showing us the way. Then thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much for the study, and I hope we will have a very good debate after the last presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. I'm sure we will have a very interesting conversation, but not before we hear from Friedolin Strack from Berlin. Mr. Strack is Managing Director at the Asia Pacific Committee of German Business and head of the German Federation of Industries International Markets Department, covering Asia Pacific, Latin America, and the MENA region. For more than 20 years, he's been focusing a lot of his work on economic relations between the EU and China, and he's been playing a central role in many of the also government-to-government contacts. He does hold degrees from the Free University of Berlin and the College of Europe in Bruges. Please, Mr. Strack, it's your turn now.
Thank you for your kind introduction, Reinhard Bütikofer. Thanks all for giving me the opportunity to listen to the presentation of this interesting study and to make some comments. My first comment is on China looking into the Chinese economy and the problem we deal with. I would very much like to highlight the point that Wolfgang Mueller made, that it is not so easy to tackle the problems in the unfair competition vis-a-vis China. We like to label China as a hybrid economy, meaning that I know little economies with such a high degree of government influence within the economy, but also the Chinese economy on a company-to-company level is dominated in many sectors by extremely fierce competition among Chinese players, among Western companies in the Chinese market, and it's not easy to shift the burden of subsidy into the state banks and other SOEs. The problem is that the Chinese hybrid economy is such a complex system, you see acquisitions in Western countries by Chinese private players, and you don't really know where the money flows are, what the ownership structures are, what role the party plays in using companies in their international strategy, in fitting it into the Chinese pattern. This is the problem we deal with, our talking about making our instruments more robust, that we agreed on last year, all on the European level. If I look at the Commission communication on China, if I look at its adoption in the Council, if I look at January's Business Europe China position paper, it's all reflected in these position papers that we do need more robust instruments without getting protectionist. That is my next point. And I like to, at least for 1 second, point to the difficult situation we are in. First of all, we see a huge trend of national policies across the world using trade policy as an instrument of national interests. And we should be very clear that as long as we live with export-driven economies such as the German economy, we need open world markets, and we need a focus on keeping markets open, and we should live up to what we preach to others, meaning that national tendencies we see in the US, using national security as an excuse for protectionism, we should not run into this trap on the European side. I would also like to mention that in fighting the economic negative consequences of Corona, we heavily deal with subsidies in the European economies, and we need to be very clear in our precise rules how we do it. What is our strength is we are democracies and we are market economies. And we have, I would say, we have 4 basic principles when we deal with trade policy in economics and subsidies. What makes a distinction to other economies? First is our obligation to a very high degree of transparency. We need to be serious in the Corona time to live up to our high standards of transparency in helping out our national industries through the crisis. The second is, and this is a very important WTO criteria that the study pointed to, it's the governance questions. If the state influence reaches into governing of companies, then this is an important definition where the state influence is visible in the economic structure. We should be careful in governance obligations on the companies. And 2 more principles: we stick to the rule of law. This is clearly our strength. We need to do it. I don't want to hear complaints from the Chinese side that we similar what we accuse the Chinese, that they formally meet WTO obligations, but they don't live up to the spirit of WTO. We should not fall into this trap on the European side, and we clearly should be non-discriminative in what we do. So, having said that, I agree with a lot that has been said in the recommendations of the study. Let me mention for one time the problem with anti-dumping from the business perspective. Anti-dumping, anti-subsidy is like the situation where you have a thief sitting somewhere abroad, and you know the thief, but you must let him steal your property before you can accuse him of doing damage. This is the situation in anti-dumping and anti-subsidy. You first have to let the foreign party do the damage before you can accuse him having done the damage. Hopefully, it's a legal instrument with a protective measure that once you get one thief, the other thieves think we are not a good place in Europe where you can steal property. So, but the basic principle is for our companies that first the damage is there, and then we come with countervailing measures. For China, if I look at the recommendation, there are very good elements with the core assumption that it would be in favor of the European Union in the long run to follow a country-specific approach. At least I would like to set a question mark, because if I look at other discussions in other contexts, the international procurement instrument, dealing with IT security in 5G, and the discussion around Huawei, it is part of the strength of our rules to make our legal system non-discriminatory. So I'm convinced that we have a special problem in dealing with China. We need powerful instruments, as has been said by Wolfgang Mueller. We need to look into a phalanx of instruments, including investment screening, including more stringent use of anti-dumping and anti-subsidy, as Wolfgang Mueller has pointed out. We need more work on the international procurement instrument, and I hope that the European institutions pick up speed in this instrument again, because it fits well into the pattern. I would even argue that we should further steps towards a European investment screening that goes beyond what we do at the moment, which is more a transparency instrument. Besides what we do in the EU and good ideas such as shifting the burden of proof to economies that are not 100% market economies, I clearly see a need that the EU must be one of the front runners in WTO reform of anti-dumping and anti-subsidy, because what we talk about here is anti-subsidy in trade in goods. We do not cover trade in services because it's simply not covered by the WTO. We do not cover severe issues such as e-commerce and data transfer, and we need new rules, international rules in this area. Since I'm convinced that the way to WTO reform is a very stumpy way, I'm very much with the proposal of what was suggested by a recently mid last year published study of Bertelsmann Foundation together with the Rhodium Group and the Berlin-based China Institute for Mercator Institute for China Studies, MERIX. And one of their core proposals was that in tackling the special problems of a hybrid economy such as China, it would be good to combine different instruments into a set of new plurilateral rules of like-minded countries. And I think this is an exercise, if I look at new initiatives such as the trilateral initiative of EU, Japan, and the US towards anti-dumping reform in the WTO. If I look at the Blue Dot initiative of the United States and Japan in international project finance, I think there is a lot of ground for joint rules among market economies that think they want to live with open economies, but have stronger rules to protect the functioning of their market economies. And in this sense, I think the study sheds a very good light into what can we do under the existing legal framework, but in the framework of our market economy, protecting market economy and not protecting markets. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much also, Mr. Strack. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it would be your opportunity to join the conversation. There are two ways of doing that. Either you can send a question or a remark to the email address that you find in the chat, or you can raise your hand. And if you do raise your hand, I would then unmute you and ask you to unmute yourself too. Please take the initiative and indicate whether you want to address any of the questions. Maybe you should also tell us if you want to address the question not just to Professor Bungenberg and Mr. Van Vaerenbergh, but also to our three commentators. I think they would be more than happy to also respond if you address them. So I'm looking for raised hands. I'm not seeing any yet. Oh, well, maybe Mr. Bungenberg, it would be a good idea, yeah, to give you a chance to react.
Others join this discussion. Probably just a remark to Mr. Strack. I mean, our starting point was 15b, so this is the reason why it is country specific. With other countries, with other WTO members, we usually don't have this opportunity. But other than that, I would totally agree that we should not go for country-specific approaches. But here we have an exception because starting point is 15b, and also that actually the Chinese experience developed in a different way than we expected some 20 years ago. Second point, just very briefly, you mentioned to actually get it all together into, well, in one plurilateral agreement. Technically, I think that is a very interesting thing then. So I'm looking forward to this discussion, because then we're taking unilateral approaches as we are seeing them right now with investment screening, with public procurement and the international procurement instrument. So actually discussions outside, especially WTO and GATT, then to a new international agreement, be it plurilateral, be it multilateral. But that is a difficult task because, again, it's getting from a unilateral approach, individually taken by United States, Canada, European Union, all somehow slightly different if we take a look at investment screening, then to plurilateral agreement. So that would be a task, but actually taking up all these different instruments that are discussed right now and putting them in one plurilateral agreement, well, that'll be from an academic point of view a huge task to discuss this. So I'm looking forward to this discussion already.
Thank you, Professor Bungenberg. I must say that you're touching upon a discussion that we're also having in the European Parliament when we, for instance, look at the enforcement regulation that is now under consideration. To what degree do we want to insist on keeping the multilateral order? To what degree will we substitute that with a plurilateral approach? And to what degree, beyond just bilateral agreements, will we then use bazookas to unilaterally make sure that we will not be losing trade conflicts. And I think all of that is at stake, and all of that is being discussed. And I'm not sure there's just a simple answer that integrates all the different the different concerns. From my point of view, I would tend to hold on to multilateralism as much as we can, in particular because there are, of course, also trading partners that are not comprised with the groups that we've talked about so far. But I want to give the floor to participants and let them ask their questions. And I have a few, so I will read one or two and give you a chance to respond. The first question that I read comes from Jürgen Mattes from the German Economic Institute in Köln, who says two questions. What does Mr. Mueller think about the chances of shifting the burden of proof within the existing legal framework, possibly envisioning the forthcoming new instrument the Commission will propose? And second, there have been far-reaching proposals to reform the ASCM in the WTO by the trilateral meeting. What is the political status of these proposals? Is it already being discussed in the WTO? What can be done to make it happen? And then there is another question that goes to the related issue of FDI screening. And this is from Jens Felten, and I'll read it. I'm interested in the topics linked to FDI screening mechanisms. The FDI screening regulation is adopted and will fully apply as of October. In addition, it seems like the Commission is already planning a new screening mechanism. The FT reported that in its white paper on an instrument on foreign subsidies, the Commission will propose, among others, a screening that addresses subsidized foreign investment into EU firms. Do you think that this shows that the FDI screening regulation is already considered as insufficient to address the EU's and the member states' concerns about foreign investors? And can we expect to see more concrete screening mechanisms in the future that address the real concerns about foreign investors, such as industrial policy, infant industry, media dependency, etc., concerns that are in the FDI screening disguised as security interests? I would like to comment on that, but I refrain from that, and I will give the floor first to Mr. Bungenberg, and then to Mr. Mueller, and then maybe some of the other experts want to join in, and then we'll take more questions.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Bungenberg.
So actually, I can only comment probably on the second question. The first one by Mr. Mattes, they were, I think, directed to Mr. Mueller. So in regard to the FDI screening mechanism, I mean, we have to remember that actually it is a regulation, yes. It is discussed that it is an EU instrument, but well, what does it do? It coordinates at the member states level, and there are still, from my perspective, still a lot of loopholes to get around screening, because it is not an EU screening with a final decision, but it is member states screening mechanism within 14 EU member states right now, and these screening mechanisms are coordinated, and probably a statement is coming from the EU Commission, but not a final answer is given by the EU Commission itself. So I think, and this was also discussed in the past years, do we need more on the EU level itself in regard to screening? And I indeed think it is necessary to tie this to also merger control issues when we have influences coming from third states, together with also subsidization of state-owned enterprises then entering European markets. So from my perspective, the screening mechanism is still insufficient. It only tackles some sectors right now. It coordinates the member states, but we need to actually coordinate the existing screening mechanism with an EU level screening, and also coordinate it with a competition law especially. So I think there's still a lot to do. Again, a lot of work has been done in the past couple of years in this area already, but there's still some leftovers.
Thank you. Mr. Mueller?
Sorry, I was just on perhaps one word on investment screening on top of what Professor Bungenberg said. I think the investment screening we have so far is simply a screening where we look into concerns concerning public order and security, and where we inform each other where member states can coordinate. What we are going to see on or what is at issue in the white paper is another point, and that is the question of subsidies used in order to purchase European companies. So you cannot say that the new instrument is going to make the other one superfluous. No, it's simply we have dealt with one aspect by the investment screening, and now we are looking into how to address the other aspect, and that is subsidies. With a new instrument. I think one should simply see that this is sort of step-by-step approach. Now, more specifically to the questions by Mr. Mattes and by Mr. Felten. No, by Felten, I think we have already dealt with. The trilateral process has resulted in January in a joint declaration by the three trade ministers, or by the two ministers plus our commissioner, and the discussions are still going on, and the discussions are also going on. There's a certain outreach, and there is which also includes of course Japan, but these discussions are not easy, because there are very complex questions, and the questions have probably become even more complex in the light of the experience we have made in the current pandemic, where all states in fact had to take significant amounts of money into the hand in order to make it possible to ease the burden on the population, on companies which are resulting from the close downs and all this type of thing. And that brings me perhaps to one issue which Mr. Strack also has said about these plurilateral agreements, and I think Mr. Bungenberg, you have also commented on that. To the extent we have legal obligations, it is necessary that the behaviors of those we want to address, they should be part of these plurilateral agreements, because otherwise you would simply breach the law. So there is no point in dreaming up something and having a new law there, which is in conflict with existing law. Or with existing obligations. I think that is something we have to bear in mind. I would leave it with it, but I would like to have later on again the floor, because there is one issue which I would like to address.
Okay, we'll remember that. I had a hand raised by Jana Titievskaya. I am unmuting you, and if you unmute yourself, you can talk, madam.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I also emailed the question, so, but yeah, I work as a trade analyst in the Parliament's research service, and maybe a general question to the panelists on kind of a general and understandable worry that commentators and citizens are raising about whether the post-COVID economic recovery measures will bring about a range of subsidies that might actually somehow be challenged under the WTO. So to what extent should we also worry within the EU about ensuring that our subsidies are WTO compliant going forward in this economic recovery?
Thank you. Then I would like to ask a question of my own. If I listened correctly and didn't miss the real message, I would say, Mr. Mueller, that you basically argued that number one, the anti-subsidy instrument that we are applying is already very powerful, that we are already using other country benchmarks, so we don't need to do that based on Article or Section 15B of the Accession Protocol, and that you're quite happy with applying the rules, the general anti-subsidy rules, and effectively don't see a need or an interest in coming up with a new instrument based on Article 15B. Is that, have I understood you correctly? And if so, I would of course like to pass the question also back to Professor Bungenberg, who has not made the case that we should do it, but has made the case that we could do it, and ask him if he wants to take one step beyond that and argue from his experience and from his position what could possibly be the advantages of going down that road. So first, a question from the participant, Mr. Bungenberg. Do you want to address it first?
Well, okay, yes. So what are the advantages? Do we need it? We did look, Mr. Van Vaerenbergh and myself, we have been involved in investigations. So again, I used the word earlier, ivory tower. So we are trying to follow what is discussed. And what we are reading again and again in parliamentary hearings in Europe, also across the Atlantic, in testimonies, is that we are facing a lack of transparency, especially in the field of state-owned enterprises and subsidies. That actually no country, no WTO member actually complies with the transparency obligations laid down in the WTO agreements. And when there's no transparency, it is hard to calculate a benefit. And for that reason, actually, we came up with the idea, and it's also this issue, this debate about what is a public body, and a very restrictive approach taken there by the WTO appellate body. And well, these are actually the 2 points that we argued seem to be, well, a barrier for the application, a difficulty for the application of the existing instruments. And both issues, public body definition and only little transparency in a lot of jurisdictions in the field of subsidization, especially in China, can be tackled with our approach, with the shift of burden of proof, which actually is not a new invention, but this is actually what was discussed under the anti-dumping instruments, also the EU anti-dumping regulation with the alternative benchmarks and so on. So we actually try to come up with a proposal how to tackle existing difficulties. And again, if it's necessary, we being here in Saarbrück at the university cannot really judge if it's necessary or not. This is up to the Commission, this is up to the industries. If they have the information they need to start an investigation, if the Commission has enough information to actually go through the entire investigative procedures.
Thank you. I would propose that we start giving our panelists a last round of opportunities for coming in. Mr. Mueller has already asked for the floor. I put a question to him too. I would then also ask my colleague Rodriguez-Pinero and Mr. Strack. And then, unfortunately, we're already almost out of time, even though this is very exciting and interesting. But I would say, Mr. Mueller, you take the floor now. And I'll wrap it up at the end. Please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Thank you. I think first to the question of a participant from the service in the parliament. Do we not have a WTO problem with all the subsidies we are giving? And the response to this is, I think we have to be careful. The WTO, the anti-subsidy agreement, does not exclude to give subsidies to the economy, but it has to be done in a way which is non-discriminatory, which does not pick out certain industries and not others. So if you give money in order to strengthen the economy in general, that is fine when you don't have a problem with WTO rules, when the subsidies are not specific and hence they would not fall under the discipline. So I think if we remember this to the extent possible, that we don't discriminate, but we support the economy in general in a non-discriminatory way, then we shouldn't have really a big problem. Now turning to now there is one point in relation to what Mr. Strack has said, where he was bringing this where he was sort of having this example very illustrative with a thief. You first have to wait until the thief has stolen the property and then you can react. It is true that in the vast majority of cases, our anti-dumping and our anti-subsidy measures are based on actual injury. So the damage has already been done and the measures aim at redressing the injury for the future. But the rules also allow for going for threat of injury, and the Commission has done this also in the past. We have taken measures based on threat of injury, so where the industry did not suffer yet the injury. But the standard which we have to apply there is sort of we have to see that the thief is coming its way if you want to stay within that picture that Mr. Strack has used. So everything depends on the industry making its case, and then the Commission investigating this, that we can see the thief sort of coming. And then we don't have to wait for the injury as such, but we can already act before. And the last point in relation to what your question and also the comment Professor Bungenberg has made, in terms of Article 15b is about the benefit, about the calculation of the amount of the subsidy. So is the subsidy 10% or is it 15%, or did the company not get a benefit, for instance, from the loan? There we are perfectly happy with the existing rules. The rules are complicated. Geneva, the dispute settlement system is demanding. But I think we have managed so far in complying with these rules. So I personally, and I think that's true for the department, we don't see really any problem in calculating the benefit, in determining the amount of a subsidy a company has received. What is sometimes more complicated is the existence to determine whether a subsidy exists. So was there a loan, for instance, which was subsidized, or sort of to detect the methods the state are supporting the companies? That is sometimes problematic, and where we indeed have a problem also at WTO level, because Professor Bungenberg was referring to the transparency requirements, the notification of subsidies. These obligations are often not really followed or not completely followed, and the trilateral initiative has taken up this issue as well. But again, if more could be done, and the instruments would probably be stronger if the transparency rules were better. But at the same time, I think our practice also shows that so far we have managed, although with considerable effort, to unearth the subsidies and to go after them. And I can only read the regulation on lorry and bus tires from China, where you see the full panoply of support which has been given to Chinese companies. I would leave it with that.
Thank you. Inmaculada, Mr. Strack, you have 1.5 minutes each, roughly, to come in, because we have a limited time frame. Please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much again. I think it has been a very interesting debate, and I want to only make a reflection. I think we are here, the representatives from private sector, from academia, and from the Commission and from the European Parliament. And I think the way we have to work in order to face all the challenges we have before COVID-19, but more now post-COVID, is to work together in order to identify the problems we face and in order to define the way we have to make the solutions. I think the protocol of market economy status, the Article 15, is a very good example of what we don't repeat again. It's a very complicated reduction in order to interpret of different ways, and we need to suffer the consequences of the way we expressed the rule of law in order to try to defend about the consequences. I think it's a very, very good example that this is not the way to work in the future. For me, it was very interesting to listen, Mr. Strack, about the real problems you have to face in order to compete in the same, under the same rules. And I think for the Commission has a very good opportunity of better regulation, because I think still we have better trade defense instruments than before, but not enough. I think they are complicated to use. They are very slowly procedures in order to be able to use them. And I think this is a good way to try to working together in the future to improve our trade defense instruments, to improve the competence under the same way of using the rules of law and the market economy. Thank you. Thank you very much for all your speeches and all your understandings.
Thank you, dear colleague. Mr. Strack, please.
I take 10 seconds to thank you, Reinhard Bütikofer, for picking up this important issue and shifting out of the expert circle in such a good discussion we had today. For the rest of my 80 seconds, I would like to take one, from my perspective, still open question from the discussion. The second question was related to investment screening. I cannot give an answer on European investment screening, but I can give my opinion. And my opinion, living in Germany, working for the German industry, is that we see a trend in some member states, especially Germany, where we have constantly a shift into more and more government control over investment screening. And what we instead propose is rather having clearer guidance for foreign investors and a clearer legal picture. The Commission started working in investment screening in a time when there were member states, they didn't even have an investment screening system in place. So I think the first step of the European investment screening system was an extremely smart system enabling the Commission to do something. We have a good transparency now over national investment screening. There is a good exchange on how it works. And my personal opinion is, yes, we should proceed in joint European rules on ownership transparency and using, and today's session has taught me a lot, we should much more use instruments like anti-dumping in investment screening, because this is a good legal basis and it gives foreign investors a certainty rather than shifting it into national security and national interests, which are usually very vague principles. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you. I think I have only 30 seconds to wind this up. Thank you in particular to the co-authors, Mr. Bungenberg and Mr. Van Vaerenbergh. Thank you to our experts. Thank you to all the participants. And we're looking forward to the next round of discussion, probably about the Commission's white paper. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Yeah, see you soon, hopefully.
Okay, I hope so. Bye.
Bye-bye.